When the last pump broke and the crops began to wilt, everyone said the farm was finished. But in a dry ditch with nothing but scrap parts and stubborn hope, Eli Granger built a machine no one believed could work. Before we turn the wheel on this story, let us know where you're listening from, and if Depression-era ingenuity strikes a chord, subscribe for more tales that still hum with life in the dust. The wind had blown hard the night before, stripping what little green was left from the cotton rows. By morning, the dust clung to everything: boots, lungs, breakfast plates. Eli Granger stood at the edge of his irrigation ditch, watching water trickle down to a dry stop. The pump had gone quiet. Not a sputter, not a groan, just silence. He didn't curse, didn't stomp. He just leaned forward, placed a calloused hand on the rusted pipe, and felt for the ghost of vibration that should have been there. Nothing. He'd rebuilt that pump twice already, once with borrowed parts and once with scrap. Now it was done for good. The mechanic in town, Gus Mather, said it plain 2 weeks back. "You're milking a dead cow, Eli. Let it go." Eli hadn't listened then. But now, the pump had made the choice for him. The July sun was already pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck, and it wasn't even noon. The okra leaves had curled up tight, trying to save what little water they had in them. The corn, what hadn't already burned off, was tilting, desperate and brittle. The soil was cracked open like a dried tongue. Eli's boy David, just 13 and all elbows, sat on the fence with his feet swinging. "Should we head to town, Pa?" he asked, like maybe a miracle was waiting at the hardware store. Eli shook his head once. No money, no parts, no use. He said it like he was closing a gate, firm and final. But even as the words left his mouth, something had already started moving behind his eyes. A memory, a thought, a wheel turning in his mind. That evening, while David fed the chickens and his wife Miriam lit the kerosene lamp inside, Eli walked out to the back shed. It was little more than a lean-to stacked with junk spokes, springs, axles, a busted cotton gin gearbox, and the bent skeleton of an old Model A Ford. He ran a hand along the tire rim, still whole, still round, still spinning freely on its axle. He didn't smile. He just studied it, then walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and one of David's school notebooks. As the lantern flickered against the wall, he began to sketch. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of worry, he'd done plenty of that already, but because his hands itched to build, to turn loss into motion, to see if a man could coax water from the earth without a motor just by turning what others had left behind. By dawn, he was back in the shed. Miriam handed him a biscuit and a mug of chicory coffee and didn't ask questions. That was the nature of 2 years with Eli Granger. You didn't interrupt the quiet when it had purpose behind it. Eli started by stripping down an old axle. The tire from the Model A was solid enough, but he needed more than a wheel. He needed a crankshaft, a pulley, something to move water uphill with nothing but sweat and stubbornness. He pulled a length of chain from a rusted bicycle, tested its give, then jotted notes in the margin of his son's spelling book. He worked in silence, except for the occasional grunt or the clang of metal hitting dirt. The shed became a forge of ideas, hot with effort and quiet fury. Dust fell from the rafters every time he slammed a wrench or lever into place. David came out mid-morning. "What is it?" he asked, voice uncertain. Eli wiped sweat from his brow with a stained rag. "It's a pump. Don't look like one." "Not yet," Eli said. By week's end, something had taken shape. A wood frame, bolted to the banks of the irrigation ditch. A lever ran through, the hub of the old car wheel, extended with iron pipe to create a makeshift crank. When Eli pushed the bar, the wheel turned. Attached to it by salvaged rods was a piston assembly, wooden discs sealed with waxed cloth, sliding through a scavenged pipe Eli had reamed smooth with a rasp. Water moved. Not much, but it moved. "That'll never keep up with a real pump," said Leroy McCain, one of the neighbors who'd wandered over out of curiosity or maybe just boredom. "It doesn't have to," Eli replied. "It only needs to keep the okra alive," McCain spat in the dust. "That contraption's gonna fall apart in a week." Eli didn't argue. He just kept working. At night, he and David would test it in shifts, pushing the crank, watching the stream trickle out the other side. Every day, Eli would tweak something, adjust the bearings, add tension, reinforce the frame with scrap barn wood. By the second week, the system could push enough water to wet a quarter acre in an hour. Word got around. A few folks came to watch most, with folded arms and smirks. "Granger's gone cracked," someone muttered. "Trying to irrigate with a junkyard." But some stayed longer, watched closer. And when they saw the earth dampen where before it had cracked, their laughter thinned. Eli wasn't trying to make history. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was just trying to keep his fields from dying. And day by day, the wheel kept turning. By the third week, the pump no longer coughed. It breathed. Each morning before the sun cleared the cottonwoods east of the field, Eli and David took their places. David on the treadle, Eli at the crank. Together, they moved the earth's blood a few inches at a time, guiding it through furrows that had gone without water for far too long. The treadle was David's idea. "Like a sewing machine, only bigger," he'd said. Eli nodded once, then handed him a wrench. They built it using slats from a broken windmill and part of a wagon tongue. When David walked in place, the wheel turned. When Eli cranked, the piston breathed deeper. Water, once a memory, became motion, became promise. Neighbors stopped laughing. They still didn't believe. But they stopped laughing. The first to ask for help was Amos Dillard, a proud man whose fields lay just west of the Grangers. He arrived on foot with his hat in his hand and dust in his beard. His well had gone brackish. His cattle drank mud. He stood at the edge of Eli's ditch, watching the wheel spin. "You chargin' for this miracle?" he asked. Eli wiped his hands on his trousers. "No. You got a wheel?" "Off a 29 Essex. Still rolls." "Bring it here." That was the deal. No money, just parts and effort. Eli showed him how to set the frame, how to build the piston sleeve, how to mix wax and cloth to seal the chambers tight. Amos left with notes and oil on his shirt. Within 2 weeks, he had water. Not much, but enough. Others followed. A man from town. A widow with 2 boys. One family brought a rusted washing machine drum, asking if it could be used. Eli studied it a moment, then said, "We'll find out." No 2 pumps were the same. Some had car wheels, some bicycle rims. One used a wind-up phonograph spring as a return coil. Eli helped build them all, never asking for a dime. What they lacked in polish, they made up for in grit and desperation. By August, 7 farms in the valley were pulling water with machines. No one had asked for machines built from junk and guided by the calloused hands of men who weren't ready to quit. Miriam watched from the porch most evenings. She never said much, but her eyes held something steady when she looked at the ditch, like a quiet thanks that didn't need speaking. David grew leaner from the work but walked straighter. His hands began to look like his father's, tough, sun-browned, capable. And Eli? Eli just kept refining, always adjusting, always listening to the ganner squeak of a bearing or the rhythm of the wheel. Every spin was a small defiance. What they were building wasn't just a pump, it was a way forward. And in a land where hope had to be handmade, that was everything. He showed up on a Thursday driving a government truck with U.S. Soil Conservation Service stenciled on the side in letters big enough to read from the barn. Clean boots, slick haircut, eyes that scanned everything like he was measuring it against a clipboard in his head. His name was Martin Ellis, and he spoke with the certainty of a man who'd only read about failure. "Mr. Granger," he said, offering a soft hand. "Heard you've invented something interesting." Eli wiped grease on his pants before shaking. "Didn't invent anything. Just turned a wheel." Ellis smiled politely, clearly unconvinced. He pulled a leather notebook from his satchel. "We've heard of similar contraptions. Makeshift treadle pumps out of Bangladesh, bicycle pumps in Egypt. But out here in Oklahoma, using tires well, that's new." He crouched beside the pump, peering at the worn spokes and greased bearings. "You draw plans?" he asked. "No need," Eli replied. "Each one's different." Ellis started sketching anyway angles, crank positions, seal placements. "You could patent this. Might be worth something." Eli looked down at the cracked earth. "If someone's thirsty, I'd rather hand him a bucket than sell him the recipe." Ellis blinked. You sure? Government could help scale this. You could be part of a bigger solution. I'm helping now, Eli said. That's big enough. Ellis left with his sketches and a head full of theories, but without what he came for. Eli never gave him a blueprint, only a nod and the same advice he gave every neighbor. Find a wheel. The rest you'll figure. That night, 7 men came to the Granger place. Each one had built a pump. Each one had pulled water when nothing else worked. They didn't come with praise. They came with a gift, a single box wrapped in brown paper and string. Inside, a new pair of boots. Not new, really. Hand-me-downs, patched and polished, passed around the county for years when someone needed them. But clean, whole, dry. Fit for a man who kept us from drying out, Amos said. Eli didn't say anything, just nodded, then set them by the door without ceremony. Rain came 2 nights later. Not a flood, not enough to turn fortunes, but enough to ease the edges of fear. You could smell it before it hit wet dirt and ozone. It soaked the canvas tarps and painted the porch dark. David stepped outside and tilted his head back like he'd forgotten the sky could do this. Eli watched the pump through the downpour. The wheel turned slow, left in motion by habit or faith. Later that week, a boy down the road built a pump of his own, used an old wheelbarrow rim and some cloth straps. It squeaked and shook and pulled water in half spoons. It was the worst one yet. And it worked just fine. 10 years passed, and the pump still stood. The frame had gone gray from sun and time. The wheel, once clean and sure, wore a coat of rust and prairie dust. The ditch it once fed had narrowed to a trickle, overtaken by grass and disuse. Most farms had long since moved on to diesel rigs, and then electric ones, as wires crept across the land like a second kind of root system. Progress had arrived, humming on poles and spinning in turbines. But the pump remained. David ran the farm now. He was taller than Eli ever was, broad-shouldered and fast with his hands. He kept new machines running and new rows straight. He didn't need the old water wheel, but he never took it down. He oiled it once a year, painted the bolts red so they wouldn't seize, left it there like a gravestone for something that once mattered deeply. Eli still lived on the property, in the smaller house they built when the new barn went up. He spent most mornings on the porch with coffee and silence, watching the land that had once broken him try to become kind again. He didn't talk much about the old days, unless someone asked. Even then, the words came slow and simple. One spring, a photographer came through part of some WPA oral history project, cataloging the resilience of Dust Bowl holdouts, as they called them. He'd heard about Eli's pump from a county office in Enid. "Just want a photo," he'd said, "maybe a few lines from you if you're willing." Eli had shrugged. "Take what you need." The man took 3 photos, one of the pump, one of the house, and one of Eli with his hand on the old iron crank, looking not at the camera, but just past it at something only he could see. "What made you build it?" the man asked. Eli thought for a moment, then said, "All I did was keep the water moving." That line made it into the article. No grand philosophy, no talk of invention or heroism, just the truth of it. Years later, that photo would hang in a museum, part of an exhibit called Machines of Survival. But Eli never saw it there, never needed to. Sometimes in the fall, local school kids would take field trips through the old farm roads. They'd stop by the Granger place, where David's wife kept a small roadside stand selling honey and jam. If they asked about the strange wheel by the ditch, she'd tell them a little. How it worked, why it mattered, what it meant. Then she'd pause and say, "My father-in-law built that during the worst of the dry years. Saved more than just our farm." And the kids, their shoes clean and their bellies full, would nod like they understood. But they didn't. Not really. Only a few still did. The men who'd built their own versions, most of them gone now, used to say that Eli had taught them more than mechanics. He'd reminded them of something older than machinery. That invention doesn't always come from books, and survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a man in a shed, turning a wheel no one else sees value in. Because there's nothing else left, and that has to be enough. When Eli passed, they buried him on the hill above the field, facing east where the sun rose over the rows he'd once watered by hand, and down by the ditch, the pump stood silent. The wheel didn't turn anymore, but it didn't have to. It had already done its work. And the land remembered.